In this video, let's discuss activating macros. Activating macros is different from running macros. Both activities launch or invoke macros, but activating is something that is done to macros from inside a .mex library, using a hotkey, short key, schedule, pop-up, or floating menu. External .mxe playable macros cannot be activated using these features. To invoke the Add Macro dialog, we must first open Macro Explorer. You can do that by double-clicking or single-clicking on the M located in your system toolbar. If it's not located there, you can go through Start, Programs, and then Macro Express, or whatever location you installed the default folder to when you were first installing Macro Express, and then simply click on Macro Express 3. I've got it already launched, so I'm just going to go back into my Macro Explorer. From here, there's two ways to create a new macro. First, we can left-click on Macros and Add Macro. I'm going to click Set or Cancel so I can show you the second way. Next, you can right-click anywhere in this white area on the right task pane and click New Macro. From here we have quite a few options. The default for a macro to run is selected on hotkey. However, for this exercise, let's go ahead and click No Activation. And we're going to click on the scripting editor, which will allow us to manually script a macro file. What's nice about Macro Express is if you decide that you want a different hotkey or you want to activate the macro a different way, if you go through the Macro Explorer, and I'm just going to save this temporarily. I didn't name the file, so it shows right here. You can, if you want, not name the macro. However, I definitely recommend that you do. And I'm going to show you how. If you double click on the macro, it should start the scripting editor, and you'll know where you're located with the top bar saying the location. If you click on Properties, you can now type in a nickname for this macro file. So I'm just going to type in test macro. If you selected no activation like I did, you should have no check marks in any of these boxes. However, if you did, you might already have like the hotkey box selected or the schedule box, any number of those selected. You can also have multiple ways of having a macro activate. Let's go ahead and set a hotkey to this macro. I'm going to select the hotkey box and hit Set Hotkey. From here we can select a hotkey activation using several different options. First, if we come down to our selection window, we can scroll using the scroll button on your mouse or using the scroll bar on the side of the window. And you can either choose one through this method, and as you can see, it'll change what's given in this box above. The other option is if you say you want Control-Alt-4 and you already know that's what the key you want, you can select up in this box and press Control-Alt-4, and it should automatically jump to where that's located in this list. Once you do that, select OK. Well, if you're like me, you like to see results. So you may try to jump back to the Macro Explorer and press Control-Alt-4 and notice that nothing happens. Well, that's because we really don't have a script yet to try this on. So let's go ahead and go into our script option. If we select the Dialogues button and put a text box display in and say hello, and say this is what the hotkey does, and then pressing OK, and then we need to either save this or we can click the Macro Explorer to have it prompt us whether we want to save our changes or not. And we would like to click yes in this example. And now you should be able to see a result. If you press Control-Alt-4 and you did it correctly, you should get a screen that looks similar to this, unless you're adding this into a previously designed macro. I'm going to go ahead and right-click on this little running guy down here to cancel the macro out, or I could just press OK to our dialog. One nice thing about right-clicking on the running person down here is it will terminate the macro instead of just running the rest of the script. So if I click OK here, and there's quite a bit more to the script, it will still run the rest of the script. It's not going to stop. So let's go ahead and terminate the macro. And you should get a screen like this, unless you have used the tweak that Macro Express has released or Insight Solutions has released that allows you to disable those warning screens. I'm going to go ahead and press OK. Let's go ahead and go back into our test macro so I can show you some more options. Click on Properties. Our next option is the Scope property. And what this means is where will the macro run? So if you have Internet Explorer opened, will the macro run in that program or not? Well, that's what we have to tell it right now. The default setting is on global, so it means that it will run the macro anywhere you are in Windows. But we can be more specific with our macro. If you've created 2 or more macros with the same activation, it does not mean that they'll both run while pressing the key. What happens is the first macro that was created will run. The second one will be ignored. Our next option is Schedule. Now if you want to turn an activation method off, simply check on the box so the check mark's gone. Next, let's check mark Schedule, and we'll set a schedule. Our next option allows us to select when we want the macro to run. So I've selected weekly. If I don't want the macro to run indefinitely, I can select a date that it will run between this date and this date. I can also set a time for it to run, say 4 o'clock p.m. every week on Tuesday. And you can change that however you want. And keep in mind that this will only run this macro at the specific time that you specify. Let's go ahead and press OK. Now let's say that we want that macro to run every week on Tuesday, but in rare situations we might have to run it manually using a hotkey. So we can also select the hotkey option. And if we've already chosen a hotkey before, such as Control-Alt-4, it will show up right here. If we haven't, we can select Set Hotkey and press in the key combination that we want, say Control-Alt-3, and press OK. Alright, so let's go back into our Set Hotkey option just to make sure that it really did change over to Control-Alt-3. If it is selected, that means it's gray, right? Well, not necessarily. The Control-Alt-4 option is still grayed out, and Control-Alt-3, if I unselect it, is still black. The reason behind this is that we have not saved the macro file yet, so it has not updated the activation hotkey. So if we leave this on Control-Alt-3, we save the macro, click Set Hotkey again. Now we'll notice that the Control-Alt-3 is gray, and the Control-Alt-4 once again turns black since it's not in use anymore. You can also find out which hotkey is in use by looking over to the right side, and it will tell you if the global key is in use or not. If it is in use, it will just display white. I'm going to go ahead and press Cancel so that it stays at Control-Alt-3. Now there's a couple more options on the activation methods. Let's go ahead and unselect Hotkey and unselect Schedule. Let's set it to Short Key and click Settings. Short keys are very beneficial for starting macros. Let's say we wanted to type in an acronym or a word to activate this macro. Every time that we type in John into a document, it will type in his address, let's say. Well, this can be accomplished using a short key. And we have several different options. We can either use the global settings that we specified for the entire program, or we can customize the macro settings for this macro only. And we can require exact upper lowercase match, or match upper first character between short key and text, or do neither. Let's require it to match the exact upper and lower case. And in this box, we type in the word that we want it to match. So if I typed in John, all uppercase, every time I typed in capital J-O-N, it would activate the macro. I'll go ahead and unselect short key and select the window title. And we have two options. We can either type in what we want it to look for, or we can press browse. Well, let's open Internet Explorer so that we have something to work with. I'm going to go to google.com because the window title is short. It's only Google / and then your browser name. Let's go ahead and minimize Internet Explorer or whatever browser you're using and press browse. Well, if you notice here, we have all the different windows that are open that are visible to us as users. Hidden windows show any windows that may not be visible to us as users of Windows. These windows might include things that just run in the back end. So usually you wouldn't use those unless you were looking for a specific application when it started or something similar to that. Let's go ahead and select our Google option and press OK. Every time that Macro Express sees the window Google running, it will automatically activate this macro. Alright, so you want some proof that it works, huh? Go ahead and click Save, and you could even go into the Macro Explorer. Sometimes Macro Express will take a few seconds or even 30 seconds to a minute to activate the macro, depending on how many times the macros try to run and how many times you canceled it. If I go back into the Google screen, you'll notice that the Google window came on top, or it was in our visible presence. So what it did was activated that macro now. If we press OK, you'll notice that the macro isn't running now, but if you give it a few seconds, it should start back up again. Alright, so let's prove that this actually works now. Let's click Save and go into our Google window. Well, how come the macro hasn't started before we click on the Google window? The Google window must display or be visible to us as the viewers for the macro to start running, in this case that we just set that to activate. In other instances, it might not require it to be visible. It could be hidden from our view and still run the macro. Let's go ahead and press OK. As you can see, it ran the file again, and we press OK and it runs it again. We're almost in an endless loop because it knows that that window's on top. So what we need to do is close Google out and then press OK. Now the window won't run anymore because it can't find that window title. The scope option can be used on any one of these activation methods: hotkey, schedule, short key, window title, mouse click, or controls. If we click back on scope and we select program specific and press select, we can select a specific application that is located on our computer, say explorer.exe. Well, this is actually Windows backend, so you probably wouldn't want to select that. If you're thinking of Internet Explorer, you'd want to select iexplorer.exe and click Add. So now the program is saying if Internet Explorer.exe is running, and if it's on top, meaning it's the window that we can see, then it will run the macro. If we press OK, and then we go back into our properties, we also have a requirement or stipulation saying, so now what's going to happen in the window title, it's going to say, okay, first let's make sure it says google.com and also check for Microsoft Internet Explorer. In order for this macro to activate, it must meet both of these requirements, since I've specified a title name for the window title. If I only specified Microsoft Internet Explorer, it would wait until any Internet Explorer window came up and use that window. So if we press save and we go back into our Macro Express, and then we go to www.google.com, press enter, it now matches those requirements. Let's go ahead and close out google.com so this macro stops running, and right click on our little running guy so it ends the test macro. Our next option, if we unselect window title, is mouse click. Now this is a great feature. This allows us to select a certain area that if we move our mouse in, it will allow that macro to run. So let's say if we move our mouse up to this coordinate or down to this location, it will actually run the macro file. Let's go ahead and select the locator so that we can see where our mouse is currently at. Now you might need to write this down with a pen or a pencil, which I'm going to do now. I'm going to say my first value, where the screen position is located, is 47. This would usually be my X. My Y value is 523. My active window, which is referring to the scripting editor because that's the window on top, is negative 143 and 417. Now, as far as the active window, this number is actually incorrect. Well, according to what I told you, Macro Express is not the top window. The mouse locator is the top window in this example. So let's click on the Macro Express window. You'll still notice that the mouse locator is on top, but it is not the window selected now. But neither is Macro Express because the bar is still grayed out. Now we are using the select mouse activation window. So any movement that we see here, this active window number will represent this window. So if we actually want Macro Express's active window selected, we have to click cancel on this and then select Macro Express so it's blue in the window title. So what's the difference between a screen position and an active window? Well, the active window is referring to the application that's running. This gives you more control over where that mouse is going to click in that specific program or window. Whereas the screen position, it will select the point relative to the screen rather than what program is necessarily located there or what button is located there. In this example, we're going to use the screen position. As you may recall, my first point was 47,523. If I move down to here, I see a new screen position, which is 241 and 443, as I write these down. If we click back on our settings button under the mouse click, we now have the option again to specify our values. Okay, so first let's select which button to activate this macro with. Do we want it to activate with the left button, the middle button, or the right button? Let's say we want it to activate every time we right-click the mouse button. And what do we want it to activate under, or what to click on? Do we want it to, when it's the area of the screen or the window part? The window part is the active window, and the area on the screen is the screen position. Well, if you're like me, you probably don't really want to write down those values, so what you can do is if you move a mouse to a specific place, you'll get that screen position. If you hold down Control and press space, it will plug in that left and the top value. Now, if you go down to the bottom and the right corner, and you press Alt space, it will fill in the other values for you. That way then you don't have to write anything down, and then press OK. And you don't even actually need this mouse locator if you use this method. Otherwise you can write down the values. Let's go ahead and close that out. As far as the control option, which is our final choice, please refer to the book for information on how to use this activation method. Another thing that I want to point out is if you do have multiple options, select, say, hotkey and schedule, you can display whichever activation method you would like in the Macro Explorer using this top option. Whether you want it to say, the Macro Explorer say, schedule. So now if we click Macro Explorer, we click yes to save our changes, you can see that our activation method is using scheduled instead of the hotkey method. Even though the hotkey option is still available, but when we press Control Alt 3, that will still work. It just cannot display both of those options.